We'd like to believe that the David Berkowitzes are other people, but my presupposition in the book is there are no other people. That what is inside of David Berkowitz is Jeremiah 17, the heart of man, not the heart of a psychopath, not the heart of an antisocial. The heart of man is wicked and deceitful above all things. So I make a very timeless argument that mankind has potential for great evil. And most people underestimate the power of a situation and what it might draw out of them.
But before we get into our conversation, my name is Eric Metaxas, and this channel exists to bring you a biblical perspective on today's news, culture, and hot-button issues. If you're new here or not, welcome, and be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you are notified when new videos get posted. As you know, I grew up in New York City, in Queens. In the 70s, I remember being with my Uncle Joe. He was a firefighter in the South Bronx. And I remember all the papers were about the son of Sam, the son of Sam. It was a terrifying time in New York City. It was a terrifying time apart from the son of Sam. The city was just a mess. And then I remember they caught this guy, and theoretically he had murdered 6 people, was part of a satanic cult, on and on and on. It's become like folklore. And then I came to faith, and then I heard through a friend of mine, Pastor Don Wilkerson, who married Suzanne and me, that this guy, David Berkowitz, formerly called the son of Sam, had come to faith, was a born-again believer. Blew my mind. I looked into it. It's true. One of the greatest, most beautiful stories ever. I corresponded with David Berkowitz a couple of times. Totally changed man. Well, someone has written a book about this. I'm holding it in my hand. It's called Monster Mirror, 100 Hours with David Berkowitz, once known as Son of Sam. The author of the book, Michael Morelli, is sitting with me here. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. I'm a big fan, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Well, listen, I can't get over the fact that you wrote this book. Now, you're a little complicated. I want people to know your story before we get into the story of the redemption of David Berkowitz, which is it's just so beautiful to even think that this is true. And I know it's true. But how did you get to be who you are? How were you raised, and how did you find yourself to where you are today?
You know, like anybody, the grooming for me began at a young age. I was maybe 10 years old. My mom would take me to see my dad in prison. And my dad had a certain reputation in the neighborhood, but I knew who he was as a person, not his persona, not what was said about him, but the funny, adventurous guy. So I had this heart from a young age for those in prison, and knowing that there was a man within the monster, so to speak. In Italian-American families, when dad's in prison, the euphemism is school. So my mother would say, we're going to go see your dad in school. In fact, I said, Ma, what is he in school for? She said, law. So as a kid, I'm visiting dad. This is, a certain period of time during my childhood. And then at 17, I'm going down that same path. I'm locked up in a juvenile jail in Rhode Island. I was arrested for a string of robberies. And while I'm locked up in juvenile jail, a pastor by the name of Mike Krautman, he comes in, he shares the gospel. He's also a correctional officer within the juvenile detention. And it's the first time I experienced the presence of God, left the juvenile detention center, found a church, and never looked back. Be 46, I was at 18 years old. So it's been the last, 28 years of walking with Jesus and growing in the faith.
You went to Mount Zion
I'm
Bible
in Zion
College.
Bible College. I'm a student. Then I serve on staff at the church where I was saved, North Providence Assembly of God. And then along the way, I end up getting a master's degree from Liberty, plant a church from North Providence. We leave with 15 people, grow it from 15 to a few hundred in Rhode Island, pastor for about 16 years, work extensively with inmates within the prison. Also work with people in addictions. We had a very active, vibrant 12-step group. And then about pastoring, maybe 4 or 5 years into it, I start the PhD. That was 128 credit hours. So worked at the PhD while pastoring the church. And then somewhere about year 16 of pastoral ministry, I suffered 2 heart attacks. I suffered my first heart attack in the 16th year of pastoring. And then a year later, after I resigned, I suffered the widowmaker, which kills 83% of the people. I was in a gym punching a bag, and I went down, and they took me into Rhode Island Hospital, put 4 stents within my.
And you're pretty young. I mean, this is.
I was in my 40s when I had my heart attack, early 40s. And I knew it was time to resign some of the stress factors involved in pastoring a church that was largely consisting of people with addictions and all sorts of dysfunctional backgrounds. I mean, we called it the church where we keep the fun and dysfunction. And I decided it was time to resign from pastoring, and I started traveling, speaking on mental health. And right now I'm booked up from now until next year, speaking in churches and schools and prisons all across the country on mental health from a biblical perspective. And in the process, that's where I started this book on David Berkowitz's testimony.
Bull markets turn everyone into a stock market genius. Bear markets reveal who truly is. If your portfolio isn't hedged, you're gambling. A single market correction could wipe out years of gains. For nearly a decade, my friends at Noble Gold Investments have helped investors diversify by adding gold to their portfolios. Gold may help you preserve your upside potential and limit your downside risk. Visit noblegoldinvestments.com and learn how easy it is to incorporate gold into your investment strategy. noblegoldinvestments.com. You know, he was part of a satanic cult. You got to interview him for 100 hours, part of it with my friend Michael Franzese, and who's been on this show, who was one of the top mobsters in America who came to Jesus. I mean, it's so beautiful, you know, when somebody who's part of that world really dramatically comes to faith. But what was it that led you to say that I want to interview David Berkowitz? How did that happen? How did that come about?
Well, it wasn't something I saw coming. I just simply felt inspiration from the Holy Spirit to mail him a copy of a prior book I wrote, a book on mental health from a biblical perspective called Dr. Jesus. And I mailed Dr. Jesus to David. Again, I have a heart for prisoners. As a pastor, I was going into prison continually. My dad, my own background. And I heard David's testimony. And then he writes me back and he says, can you visit with me? And when I visit with him, this is early 2022. I visit with him in early 2022. And he says to me, you know, you're the kind of guy I've been waiting for, someone with both a background in psychology, but as well as an understanding of spiritual reality, to understand and to explain to the reader what was happening to me back in the 70s in this spell that I was under.
And so it's interesting to me that, you know, David Berkowitz has lived this. He understands this was not like a delusion that happened to him in his 20s. Do you talk about that in the book, about what happened to him?
Oh, yeah. I described 9 particular mental health breakdowns: isolation, shame, resentment. And I discuss how these particular themes interplay with the satanic. Satan doesn't just jump on somebody. There are doorways. And Satan knocked, David opened the door. So we're not dismissing human responsibility.
Oh, of course not.
No. This is not a devil made me do it story.
That's right.
And David's story is not just the story of the demonic, but it is also a story of mental health breakdowns and how he was easy prey for an enemy that pounced on him.
But that's what's so interesting. It's both.
That's right.
It's both. In other words, we make decisions, we end up in a place, and now we are really ripe for satanic attack. And he's the classic case of that. The loner, he was not exactly a popular, successful person. He was lost and he's looking for meaning.
Most definitely. I mean, let's take isolation, for instance. David was a very isolated individual. Genesis, God says it's not good for man to be alone. The data in behavioral science shows that when you take a rodent and you isolate it for so many days from its community and return it back to the community, it attacks the other rodents at the point of reentry. Because aggression, adrenaline goes up when we're isolated, and oxytocin, which is empathy, goes down. So in isolation, we saw this during 2020. People get very aggressive and they get less empathetic the more isolated. So David was an isolated individual. That's not to make excuses for him, but it is to shed light on some of the situational factors so that we as teachers, caretakers, parents can learn what to do differently with our child. We'd like to believe that the David Berkowitzes are other people, but my presupposition in the book is there are no other people, that what is inside of David Berkowitz is Jeremiah 17, the heart of man, not the heart of a psychopath, not the heart of an antisocial. The heart of man is wicked and deceitful above all things. So I make a very timeless argument that mankind has potential for great evil. And most people underestimate the power of a situation and what it might draw out of them. I mean, we saw that with the Stanford prison experiment back in the 70s. You know, you take average people, you put them under the right situational factors, and what's inside of us can shock us. But we're living in a very humanistic society. We think we're wonderful, and the other guy is the narcissist. Well, Monster Mirror is really putting a mirror in the face of the reader to say that if these situational factors happen to you, they happen to your kid, I believe anybody's capable of anything.
The story of David Berkowitz, for people listening, because I'm assuming too much, actually, there are people who don't know anything about this, that they're, young. So give us the basics of what happened with him.
Well, from 1975, really, all the way up until 1977, David was responsible for multiple shootings. Some of them ended up fatal. Others were injuries, also a stabbing. He also lit 1,400 fires.
What?
He lit 1,400 fires.
1,400?
Documented in a journal that when the NYPD arrested him in 1977, he had logged over a decade, going back to his early childhood, where he lit abandoned buildings, abandoned parking lots. The South Bronx, as you know, was burning down at the time, and David was responsible, unfortunately, for some of those fires. So he was a wrecking ball. As far as his involvement in satanic occultism, David made some shocking confessions in the book, and I'll let the reader read that. But he is the lone gunman behind the shootings.
Because at some point, because I followed this case for years, at some point he made it sound like it was more complicated, that he had done some of the 6 that he was accused of, but maybe not all, but he didn't want to tell on the others. But you're saying that he says he lied. Why? Well,
he lied back in the early 1990s, and he was in a great deal of denial, not wanting to face the facts of what he did, and involving other people in the crimes helped spread some of the culpability, reduce some of the shame. And during my process of meeting with him, now there are other Son of Sam researchers that I tip my hat off to that did some homework to show that this wasn't actually the case. But to actually get a confession out of David Berkowitz's mouth, it took about 50 hours of the 100 where I met with him. And I started to kind of get the sense that he wasn't telling me the truth. And then one day he called me on the phone at home and he said, I have to come clean with you about some things. And I met with him one-on-one, broke down and said, I lied. And I said, David, I said, other people might look at you right now and have a stone to throw. But to me, this is further evidence of your Christian conversion. Because let's face it, even Christians lie. I know some people have a tough time with that. He was a believer. He was a believer for a few years.
That is confusing to me, because I would think, what is the point? You give your heart to Jesus, and what is the point of hiding? You could say lie. I mean, he was sort of hiding stuff,
yes.
Which is, there's different kinds of lies. It doesn't make it right. But I'm saying, why? What was his motivation to do that? Here he is. He has been utterly forthright in saying, I'm guilty, I shouldn't get out of prison, I did these things or whatever. But so why was he shading part of this truth?
Yeah, well, he was under the pressure, not to make excuses for him. I'm just telling you what he told me.
Yeah.
He was under the pressure of certain journalists at the time that really wanted to press this particular narrative and story. He felt pressure from him. And I think he was trying to make right, wrongs with certain people he cares about. But anyway, the point is he came clean in the book. He's broken about it. He's been living with this secret for the last 30 years. And the secret has eaten away like cancer on the inside of him.
What's the larger lie? In other words, if you're accused of killing 6 people and you make it sound like, well, I only killed 3, what's the difference? I still don't understand why.
Well, because it's not just I killed 3. I was with the group, and the pressure of the group diminishes culpability within his own mind. It's like peer pressure. But David had a profile from the time he was a kid of always being a part of a group, but maintaining a rogue status.
Okay.
For instance, when he was a teenager, he was involved in the volunteer fireman club where they would put out fires. Well, that's what he did with the group. But when he was alone,
he set the fires.
He's setting fires.
Yeah.
When he's about 7 or 8, he's riding his bicycle with his friends. His friends, they all ride the bike within the neighborhood. But then David ventures off alone and drives all the way to Cos Cob. So he oh yeah. So
What?
He did. He drove to Cos
He
Cob.
drives to Connecticut?
From the Bronx.
From the Bronx,
9,
he
10 years old
drives
on his bicycle.
at that age to Connecticut.
My point is, he always had this profile where he's a part of a group,
Yeah.
but maintaining this rogue status.
But I guess the question is, was the satanic stuff real or was that
Yes.
trumped up? That was
No.
real.
There were satanic cults, which I believe the journalist did a good job at actually uncovering the reality of that.
Okay, so did he ever hear demonic voices or was that made up?
No, he did.
He did.
Yeah.
And the demon was
There was a
called Sam?
Yeah, well, they'd call it from a psychiatric point of view a command hallucination, but from a spiritual point of view, David believes, and I'm with him on this, that it was a demon talking to him, and he believed that he was at the behest of that demon in killing. That doesn't mean that resentment didn't play a role. I mean, even Ephesians tells us, be careful for the anger and letting the sun go down on your anger, for you'll give what? The devil a foothold. So certainly his own internal mechanisms were part of this. But yeah, he believed that it was his neighbor's dog, his neighbor, Mr. Carr, and he believed that Mr. Carr's dog was commanding him to go out and kill.
Did he know at the time that this is a demon speaking through the dog, or what is your sense of what happened?
He took a great deal of pride at that point in his life of being a soldier of Satan. It's how he found his significance. I mean, you wrote a book about finding meaning. That was his meaning in the world, was believing that he was this soldier of Satan. It's pretty clear in the letters that he left, the letters that he sent Jimmy Breslin, letters he left at the crime scenes, this idea that he was programmed to kill and that he was carrying out his marching orders. It gave him a sense of specialness or significance. From a psychological point of view, maybe a narcissistic profile for sure, and psychopathic. But from a spiritual perspective, David believes he was a soldier of Satan.
Was he sexually abused at a young age?
No.
What opened the door for him at such a young age, 6, 7 years old, to be like that? Any ideas?
Yeah. I talk in the book in chapter 3. I say we, meaning David and I, about shame.
Yeah.
He was shamed greatly. For instance, his teacher in the 3rd grade, she put his desk in the middle of the class and said to his classmates, "This is where the bad boys sit." And he hated going to school because he didn't want to be shamed in school. His uncle would call him fat constantly. Constantly body shaming him. He's a part of an adopted family. Always felt sort of like an outsider within that adopted family. Even though his adopted parents, Pearl and Nat, were wonderful, he still had this sense of not being really a part of the Berkowitz family. So that outsider mentality, lots of shaming incidences, definitely fueled his psychopathy. But David is responsible at the end of the day. He made choices and choices made him.
He's apprehended. He goes to prison. At what point, how does somebody like that turn to God? What in the world opened him up to turning to God?
He did have some brief Christian experiences before his killings, but they didn't last too long. It was when he was in the military. He calls it very superficial, that time of his life. While he was in prison about 10 years, first 10 years in prison in Attica, and then in Sullivan, those first 10 years were very dark. David said he still had a lot of occultic, practices in his cell. But then at the 10th year, an inmate by the name of Rick, David describes him as a short Hispanic man, approached him in the prison yard. It was during the winter of 1988, and shared the gospel with him and gave David a Gideon Bible. And David said, "I'm too far gone. Jesus would never forgive me." And Rick was very persistent. He met David outside in that prison yard consistently for 6 months. And then David finally took a Gideon Bible. He went back to his cell, opened the Gideon Bible. I think it was Psalm 34. Got on his knees. He said, "I just started sobbing." He said, "I wasn't crying because I was in prison. I wasn't crying because I ruined my life. I was crying because I sinned against heaven." And he just repented, and he woke up the next day. He said he felt like he was brand new. Now listen, David's a work in progress.
And this rankles a lot of theologically hidebound Christians that he's a work in progress, because they act like, well, you're saved, you're done. And I've fallen into that camp where you think, well, somebody's born again, that's it. And you think, no, you just crossed the starting line. Now comes sanctification. Now comes spending the rest of your life trying to become more like Jesus. But a lot of people don't want to hear that. They're just like, no, he's saved, so he's not going to sin again. But clearly, even though he has this major moment in 1988, it sounds like he's been on a journey.
Well, listen, habits are like comfortable beds. They're easy to fall into and they're hard to crawl out of. David had developed a lot of habits of deceiving, getting over on people, habits of violence. I mean, even in his early years of being in prison, he got into a couple of altercations. He was stabbed in the neck. You could see the scar. It goes all the way, probably about, 8 inches. Scar goes from the back of his neck all the way to his Adam's apple. So David, he was a work in progress. He still is. In meeting with him, I believe in his conversion, not because he's perfect. In fact, if he was perfect, I probably would disbelieve the conversion. The gemologist says if a stone is perfect, it's not a diamond, it's a cube of zirconium. It's the Home Shopping Network. So it's probably been the cracks, the flaws, the transparency of his flaws, the willingness to work through some of his character defects, to tell me about those defects. That's been, for me, the real convincing factor that this guy is the real deal. But we are, as people, sinful beings, and it's taken some time for David to confront some of those character defects. And I confront him in the book, in particular one chapter, about some of those character defects. And his response to me is very indicative of a man who's been transformed. He says, my name is Jacob, meaning I'm a heel grabber. I've been deceiving. He hugs the cactus, so to speak. He comes clean. So yes, he has been a work in progress.
How old is he now?
71.
What does he feel about himself now that he's worked hard really to share his faith? You say he's a work in progress, but he's not unclear on, the basics.
No, he knows he's forgiven, very active in his faith. He shares his faith continually, leads a Bible study once a week with other inmates, probably about 15 to 17 inmates. They actually call him Pastor Dave. He blushes at the title. It's not something he's comfortable with. But he definitely struggles with the shame of what he did. I remember one day we took a picture together. We take photos together sometimes when I visit him. And I handed him the photo. And he looked at it for a quick second and he handed it right back. He said, I don't like looking at photos of myself. And I said, what's that about, Dave? We talk a little bit about it. I describe it in the book. And it really came down to shame. He doesn't like the man he was, and he knows that man that he was is kind of omnipresent. It's in the media. He goes back to his cell, turns on the television. There it is, a documentary. One of the 46 channels on his TV and the 16-inch TV in his cell, and he's got to relive, the murders that he committed, the awful tragedies. So it's put in his face a lot, the man that he was, and he lives with the shame and the trauma of that.
Well, that's what's so interesting. You can be 100% forgiven, but there's still, I don't know what it is. It's something. We're new creations in Christ, but somehow until we're with the Lord face to face, you can't undo the murders. You can't go back. So it's hard. I think it's hardest for us to forgive ourselves. We're out of time. Michael Caporelli, thank you.
Thank you.
I look forward to our Socrates conversation. The book is Monster Mirror, 100 Hours with David Berkowitz. God bless you.
Thank you, sir.